Thank you. It says a lot about France, in fact, that France has more students studying philosophy than any other country in the world, which is probably why a typical French meeting takes 3 or 4 times longer than the same Anglo-Saxon one. I'm going to offer you this evening, in fact, a synthesis of a lot of people's work. Okay? I do not claim to be an all-out expert on all of the people we're going to discuss this evening, and I certainly don't claim to be an expert on all of their philosophical and theological principles. So what I'm offering you this evening is a quick gallop through some of the characters involved in the development of Freemasonry, and also we need to take into account always the domestic and geopolitical environment involved. You can't ignore that in the development of Freemasonry. And certainly France's and the French's philosophical approach to life had a very considerable influence within the development of Freemasonry, especially in the early years. Our first Frenchman is John Centropolis de Sagului, who, in fact, is, for terms of this evening, is the exception that proves the rule. He was a French Huguenot. Okay, the Huguenots were driven out of France in 1685 by the Edict of Fontainebleau, where Protestantism was declared illegal, and so the French Protestants, who were pretty well Calvinist in their views, so quite strongly Protestant, left France. Many went to Holland, to England, and quite a few wound up in America. There's in upstate New York, there's at least one town called Huguenot. Of course, in America it's pronounced Huguenot. And he was, the thing about the Huguenots, they were very highly respected because they had a lot of concentration on education. They generally were well educated, very professional. They added a lot of value, in fact, to London's business world. And he was educated in England, gained a BA and an MA, subsequently became a member of the Royal Society, and later, in fact, he became an Anglican priest. So he moved into the Anglican areas. I must say the Anglican Church is somewhat less Calvinist than the Huguenots. He became a member of Masonic Lodge No. 4, which met at the Rummer and Greats Tavern, and that was one of the first 4 lodges which formed the Premier Grand Lodge of England. Those 4 lodges came together. This grew fairly rapidly, and he became remembered as very involved in its early success. And he was the 3rd Grand Master in 1719, and then was later 3 times Deputy Grand Master. Quite early on, it became the custom to have a Grand Master who was a noble, a prince some of the time, etc. And so, in fact, the Deputy Grand Master actually did all the work. And so he was, in fact, in control of the operation of the early Grand Lodge and its work from an early stage. And he had significant influence on the early part of the early development. And among other things, he worked with Anderson in drawing up the famous constitutions of Freemasonry in 1723, and probably constrained Anderson on some of his more outlandish theories, which appeared in the later versions of the constitutions, and in fact involved Anderson being removed from that job altogether subsequently. And he also was very much involved in the development of Masonic charities, which became a cornerstone of the Masonic world early on. So to move on to the politics, which were right in the middle of this. So in 1668, James II had been ejected by the British Parliament, and in favour of William of Orange, a Protestant. James II was a Catholic. And subsequently, of course, there were many attempts by Catholic European powers, particularly, of course, the French, to restore him and later his son and his grandson, Boniface, to the English throne. These people were known as Jacobites, and the fear of the Jacobites ran quite deep, and as a result, the English government legislated against Catholics and also secret societies. So in the early days of the Premier Grand Lodge, in fact, they had to be very careful because not looking too much like a secret society, it could have been Jacobite. And in fact, there is a report in the London Journal that in 1722, the Grand Lodge officers consulted the government before holding the Grand Lodge meeting. So he was heavily involved in this early part. And in particularly, as a Huguenot, of course, there was no fear of him being a Catholic sympathizer, which was a good thing from the Masonic point of view. And he, in fact, was involved, I don't know if decatholicization is a good word, but removing what may look Catholic from the Masonic ritual and the secularization of the ritual, and also to a degree the simplification. Also, of course, he was a member of the Enlightenment with the Royal Society, met a lot of Masons in the Royal Society, and a scientific method of approach, which also influenced, of course, his actions. So, and this can be seen in the removal of the ritual from the point of view of the removal of 2 St. John's from the Masonic ritual in English ritual, and this actually, and the deacons were also removed in the early ritual as being, I guess, too Catholic. And this led to, in fact, accusations of de-Christianization when the Ancients Lodge was created in the 1750s. So this was a direct thing of that. Moving on to our next person, he was not actually French born, but French adopted. Andrew Michael Ramsey, commonly called the Chevalier Ramsey. He probably is best described, a lady called Lisa Keller has done a very good dissertation. And by the way, if anybody wants bibliography, I'm quite happy to provide it to them. I've got a lot. She says, Andrew Michael Ramsey was a novelist, historian, religious philosopher, teacher who had been studied mainly for his contribution to Freemasonry. His accomplishments were significant. He was an excellent example of an educated and ambitious man of the 18th century. He wrote a biography of a disgraced archbishop, therefore creating a legend for the 18th century philosophers. Yet as a historian, he got quite scathing reviews. At different times in his life, he was a Presbyterian, a Roman Catholic, a Jacobite, and a Freemason. And he also remained a quietist all of his life. His life is a study of dictionaries. So, yes, he was quite a character. He was a Scottish expatriate, and this is where it gets a bit strange and something I want to do more research on. But he was welcomed home from France by the English government. He was a Roman Catholic, a Jacobite, but he got an honorary degree from Oxford at the time when Catholics weren't allowed to study at Oxford. And he was made a Fellow of the Royal Society. So he was tutor to the eldest son of James Stuart, the Old Pretender, and offered the same position by George II to tutor his son, the Duke of Cumberland. So it makes you wonder quite what his relationship, was he a spy, a back channel? I don't know. Something I want to look into, actually. So he was made a Mason originally in London, in the Horn Lodge, Palace Yard, Westminster, and the quote from the London Evening Post on Monday night last at the Horn Lodge, whereas the Grace, the Duke of Richmond, is master, so very typical. Numerous appearance of persons of distinction, at which time they were admitted members of the ancient society of freely accepted Masons. So he became a Mason in England. He then came on to France, where he was a member of the Louis L'argent Lodge, and he was their orator. He also described as Grand Orator, equivalent to Grand Lecturer, within, and described himself also as Grand Chancellor at one time, so like a Grand Secretary. Now, at that time, within the Paris lodges, there was really no effective Grand Lodge. So these sort of titles got pushed around a bit. But he certainly moved in those sort of degrees. Now, he was very much into the sort of backstory of Freemasonry and in terms of establishing it as something linked back to the Templars and this sort of history. Okay, he established 3 degrees: the Écossais Novice and Knight Templar, which form part of the Rite of Clermont, which was founded by the Chevalier de Bonneville in 1754. That didn't really sort of last as a rite, but sort of got absorbed, I think, into the French Rite. Ramsey added a further 4 degrees: Maître Écossais, Maître élu, or Chevalier de l'Agre, Chevalier illustré de Templier, also called the Knight of the Most Holy Sepulchre, and the Chevalier Sublime, or Knight of God, making a rite of 7 degrees. And in fact, today the French Rite still runs on 7 degrees. The 3, what we would call now the blue degrees, Blue Lodge degrees, and 4 X ones. Dr. Oliver in his Historic Landmark said that Ramsey claimed that these degrees dated from the Crusades. And he visited England to try and promote them in England, and the Grand Lodge basically rebuffed him, didn't want to know. And that would really fit back with what we just discussed, the fact they didn't want, at that time, more esoteric and complicated degrees. They were trying to go the other way. But above all, of course, he's known for his oration or discourse of 1737, which included in that the theory of Templar origins of Freemasonry. He sent the oration to Cardinal Fleury, who was, in fact, the king's prime minister, effectively, major advisor, asking the church to bless this. And the oration was really targeted for the French, for the aristocracy, the gentry, and the affluent bourgeoisie, who attracting them into Freemasonry. So he played up the chivalric Templar type background and played down the old-fashioned stonemason connections, okay? Because the bourgeoisie weren't interested in that, of course. And so this was okay up to a point, but the problem was that in doing that, at that time, the politics were such that the chief minister, Cardinal Fleury, didn't want the French or the French king involved in Freemasonry. And particularly because of the Jacobite overlay in Freemasonry in France. Shortly thereafter, of course, 1745, there was a large Jacobite uprising in England which failed. And they obviously didn't want to get involved in that effort or the cost of it. So he wanted to keep them at arm's length. So the oration, it has been alluded, was in fact then the cause of condemnation of Freemasonry by the French state and the Catholic Church. Louis XV, really Cardinal Fleury, I suspect, published an edict prohibiting all those subjects to have anything to do with Freemasonry. Okay, and all Freemasonry belonging to nobility were forbidden to appear at court and risked imprisonment. And the authorities tried unsuccessfully to suppress Freemasonry in 1738, 1744, and particularly in 1745, after the Jacobite uprising in the UK. They punished any cafe owner who allowed them to meet. But as many of the lodges met in private houses of nobles, it wasn't very successful. And Cardinal Fleury also got the Pope involved, Pope Clement XII, and asked him to act. And on the 17th of April, 1738, he had the bull on Eminenti Apostolas Specula, in which Freemasonry is condemned, and Catholics were prohibited from joining Freemasonry on the threat of excommunication. And this was only raised, I think, 50 years ago, if less? However, it didn't seem to make a lot of difference, because by 1788 there were some 1,250 Masonic lodges of various sorts, many sorts. Remembering again, there wasn't really any central Grand Lodge in operation by 1788. So not a lot of impact on that. He continued to support the Jacobite causes, but he didn't really do much more with Masonry that we find on record, and he finally died in 1743. So that was Andrew Michael Ramsey. A significant effect on Freemasonry, people argue about that still. He certainly was one of the early proponents of the Chevalier, the sort of more higher degrees, but in himself didn't do a lot towards it. The man who did, and is often given as the spiritual founder of the extended French degrees, was Martinez De Pasquale. Now, his full name, I'm going to try and read this correctly, Jacques de Livron Joachim de la Tour de la Casa Martinez de Pasquale. So his father came from Spain. Sorry? His father came from Alicante, and he held a Masonic patent delivered by Charles Stuart. Jacobites again. Okay? And this is something that keeps popping up, the Jacobite influence. King of Scotland, Ireland, and England, according to Charles Stuart, also known as a Young Pretender, dated 20 May 1738, and it made him Deputy Grand Master and power to erect temples to the glory of the Grand Architect. These patents and powers were conferred, were transmittable at the death of the father to the son. So the powerful master, Joachim Don Martinez Pasquale, at 28, was a master mason and a Grand Master, effectively. Now, he spent pretty well all of his life really working on a very spiritualized movement within Freemasonry, but very different from what we know in the basic degrees of Freemasonry. Okay, not the first 3 degrees, certainly. They were very much medieval style rites. They had angels, archangels, and very Catholic forms of styles of ritual and prayer, as well as the magical and mystical use of the palms, psalms, and etc. So, as you can imagine, that was not at all popular with the UGLE. And he eventually brought this into an order which he was not actually, strictly speaking, Masonic, but composed exclusively of Masons. You had to be a Master Mason to be a member of this order. The Order de Chevalier de Maçon Élus Cohen de l'Univers, the Order of Knight Masons, elected priests of the universe. And again, this varies a bit, but it seemed to have had 9, 10, or 11 degrees, roughly. Now, so this rite caught on quite well and had temples in a number of French cities, all the major ones, in fact, in this sense: Bordeaux, Montpellier, Avignon, Foix, La Rochelle, Versailles, Paris, and Metz. The temple opened in Lyon, thanks to Jean-Baptiste Willemoes, who we're going to talk about later, and this town, Lyon, would become the spiritual capital for many years. In 1722, he had to leave France for personal reasons to go to Haiti, where he actually died in 1774. But before he left, he initiated two people who are very important to the story: Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, who continued to develop and promote what became known as Martinism and the order of the Élucoin, and John Baptiste Villemot, who we will talk about more later. So our next personage, in fact, is the principal student of Pasquale, Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin. He was initiated into the order of the Élucoin in 1765 at the age of 22, and eventually he rose to the highest degree within that order, the Rose-Croix, not to be confused with the Rose-Croix as we know it today. However, Saint-Martin wasn't entirely in favor of all of Pasquale's ideas, and particularly for the more complicated ceremonies and rites. So he actually sort of set out on a more simplified way of doing things, but again within the same philosophy. And he became acquainted with the works of someone known as Jacob Bohème, who was a mystic, and Martin calls his second teacher after Pasquale. And he said, "I owe my entry into the higher truth to Martinez De Pasquale, and I owe the most important steps I have made in these truths to Jacob Bohème." So, and he traveled extensively in England, Italy, and Germany, studying other people's views, comparing them, and his philosophical works were quite widely read. So, and in fact, he wrote a number of quite detailed books. Now, again, he developed his own group of disciples called the Society of Intimates, and this society was working towards, in his view, the purest form of spirituality. And he accepted women as well as men into this society, but a very limited number. So it was deeply philosophical. And in fact, even during the French Revolution, he continued in his works, they continued to meet, and funnily enough, he was never bothered by anybody in the Reign of Terror. He seems to have come through that untouched, which a lot of people in the Masonic world hadn't. He died at the age of 60, in 1803. Now, after he died, sort of things went quiet for a while, but then in 1888, there was an effort to restructure Martinism into an initiatic order, similar to Masonry, and it was particularly due to Dr. Gérard Encausse, also usually known as Papus, and he again was an extensive writer in philosophy, and Augustin Chabousseau, and they made this into what became the Martinist order. And the important point about this is, in fact, from the esoteric point of view, the Martinism and the Martinist order is still quite influential within Masonry for those people interested in the higher rites. So, moving on. The next person was also a member of the Élu Parfait, and the creator of the French Scottish rite, known as the ancient accepted Scottish rite, which is, of course, most of you know, got nothing to do with Scotland whatsoever. It's French, 100%. So he's generally known as Stefan Moran, and he started, in fact, with the rite of perfection in the Western Hemisphere. Again, a philosophical movement, if you like, developing beyond the basic principles of Masonry. He was born in Cahors, mid-Pyrenees, in 1717. He left France acting as a proconsul representative in Saint-Dominique, and then he came back to France in 1761, and so he was basically a French official. He left, and during this time he was doing his development. He left France again in 1762 and was taken prisoner by the English because the French were fighting the English yet again. This was the 7 Years' War, as it was called. And fortunately for him, it finished in 1763, but it reflected many of the conflicts that went on between the French and the English in the 17 and 1800s, which is another reason why French Masonry and English Masonry really didn't have much contact with each other during this period, obviously, because they were at war. However, he was taken to London. He said, I was taken a prisoner at sea, and he met the Earl of Ferrers, Viscount of Tamsworth, who was the Grand Master of the day. And he talked to him about his work in Masonry, and was well received, and in fact was made a life member of English and Jamaican lodges, because Jamaica, of course, being under English control, where he was sent back to Jamaica before making his way on Saint-Dominique. In general terms, he was well received, and obviously the wartime conflicts didn't really bother them too much. So he actually carried on from there. But in terms of his Masonic career, we don't know exactly, but he began probably in Bordeaux in the Loge La Francais, which was one of the really old lodges. I think actually, isn't that certificate over there, La Francais? Is that correct? That certificate on the desk over there, isn't that from La Francais, the lodge?
Yes.
I think. Not. Oh, it's Égalité, sorry. Égalité, okay. But at that time, in fact, mid-1700s, the Masonic strongholds were really Bordeaux, a lot of which was based around visiting Scots and English skippers, and Paris, of course, where a lot of the lodges were based around Jacobites. So it was sort of a mix there. But he founded in 1745 the Élu Parfait, and he then went on to develop his own set of degrees. Now, this was one of the most popular degrees at the time, and was linked to the Order of Royal Secret, which again was a set of higher degrees, really Christian-based higher degrees, similar really to the Martin developments. So the French Grand Lodge of Paris, we spoke about this earlier, the first Grand Lodge in France, in 1763, promulgated a right to 25 degrees with Moran, and he was issued the patent of Grand Inspector. Now, the first French Grand Lodge didn't last very long. It was replaced by the Grand Orient later in the 1700s. It was a bit of a shambles if you read about it. It was fairly loose, but he took that back, and he brought it to Kingston, Jamaica, with the English Masonry. And then later they were brought, of course, to North America in New Orleans and Louisiana. Now, at this point, things get a little bit complicated. I'm just checking the time. Yes, we're good. We got a lot of players, so I'm going to nip through them fairly fast, because he then met a brother, Hayes, and made him Deputy Inspector for North America. He later gave the same authority to a brother, Franklin, or Franken, maybe Dutch, for Jamaica, who then subsequently formed the Lodge of Perfection in Albany in New York in 1767. Brother Franklin then gave over his authority to Moses M. Hayes in 1768, and this is actually, the patent is actually shown in King David's Lodge of Newport, Rhode Island for that period. Mr. Hayes moved to Boston in 1782 and became Grand Master of Massachusetts in 1788. Okay, he then immigrated to Rhode Island, and he's obviously on the move. I don't know what he was doing exactly, and then travelled to Philadelphia, where he met a further 8 brethren who he appointed deputy inspector generals over the American states, with the exception of a guy called Samuel Myers, who got the Leeward Islands and the West Indies. So we see there's a number of players involved here. He then, one of them, Baron Moses Spitzer, lived in Charleston and then moved to Philadelphia, and then he went to Georgia, where he was a deputy for Georgia, and then returned to Charleston. And then he met one of the driving forces for the future development of this, one John Mitchell, who was who became a senior officer in Washington's Army. He was living in Charleston at the time, and he became Deputy Inspector General of the Order of the Royal Secret. So at that time it got established in Charleston, and shortly thereafter, one Alexandre Auguste de Grastilli, a retired French army officer who was a member of the Supreme Council in Charleston, then went back to France. He went back to try and get a job in Napoleon's army. It wasn't particularly successful, but he organized the Supreme Council for France, and an agreement then between this Supreme Council and, He then made an agreement with the Grand Orient of France. Now, this was the new Grand Lodge in France, taken over from the defunct Grand Lodge of France. And the Grand Orient, which became the Grand Lodge and still is today, a Grand Lodge, but now a regular. And the title then was, at that time, became ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. Rite écossais ancient et accepté was used for the first time. And then with the well-known Albert Pike becoming Grand Commander for what became the southern jurisdiction, the name came into general use. So that is really how the ancient accepted rite got to the States. Very roundabout, lots of players, but essentially it became established in Charleston and in Albany, initially as, in fact, the rite of perfection, and then became the ancient accepted rite with its 33 degrees. So again, a considerable expansion above the basic set of degrees of the original English things. So by 1788, there were some 1,250 Masonic lodges of various types recorded in France. Some recognized by the Grand Orient, some not. There were a number of Grand Lodges and then in 1789, of course, the French Revolution came about, and the situation deteriorated. And although Masonry continued to function in France, in various little islands, and of course, because it had been particularly a subject of nobility, it lost quite a few members, including the Grand Master of the Grand Orient to the guillotine. And so it lost quite a few, and some of the rites, particularly the French rite, as we know it today, were lost from usage for quite a long time. And the French rite didn't come back until 1970s, really. Sorry?
1988.
Thank you. Yeah. So, it was out of defunct for quite a while. So, moving on, our last personage, and also a convinced Martinist and a creator of the French-Scottish rite, the Rectified rite, was our previous mentioned John Baptiste Villemot. Now, he was, wrong way up. He was a silk tradesman, so fairly wealthy, living in Lyon, a French Freemason and a Martinist. And he was heavily involved in a number of the developments of Masonic high degrees. The relationship's quite complicated, and we don't have time to go into it this evening. But basically, there were a number of different degrees and particularly this strict observance degree that came out of Germany, and again was a sort of chivalric degree, the idea of chivalry and knights and all the other good stuff. And it was brought about by someone known as Karl Gotthard van Onda, and he claimed to have been initiated in these higher degrees. Again, we come back, our old friends, the Scottish Jacobites. He claimed to have got the secrets from them of the Knights Templar, okay? But unfortunately, with the 1745 revolt, his Scottish Jacobite mentors disappeared. And he lost touch with his secret masters. So that was a bit of a problem for him. Now, Willemot had become a Mason, and within 6 years, and we don't quite know the date, he created the lodge Parfait Amitié, which was then constituted by the then Grand Lodge of France. And in 1773, he was initiated into the rite of strict observance, the German rite. And again, 1776, into the order of the Elieu-Cohen. So he was sort of deeply into the esoteric side of things. So he started to actively develop what became the Rectified Scottish Rite from the sort of basic rituals of the strict observance over quite a long period, 1775 to 1809. And he, in his terms, the objects of the rituals are said to be progressive revelation of the theosophical doctrine and teaching of Martinez De Pasquale. So he was very much still sticking with the principles of Macaulay. And the Elieu-Cohen considered by him and people of the Rectified Rite to be the key to the true secret and objects of Freemasonry. And effectively, really what happened was the order de Elieu-Cohen functioned as an inner order of the Rectified Rite, sort of a masonry beyond masonry, for those people who wanted to go on with the esoteric. And there are presently officially recognized bodies working Rectified Rite in France, Switzerland, Belgium, Spain. I think now in the USA maybe one or two. Not entirely sure. But I believe there is at least one or two in the US now. Rectified Rite.
Not here in New York anyway.
Under the radar.
Sorry?
Under the radar.
Under the radar, yes, that's what I heard. I think there's one in Jersey. But so it's certainly active in Europe still, and it has a number of its the highest degrees. Whereas, the ancient accepted had these 33. The Rectified Rite, I think if I remember rightly, has 7 or 8. It's that sort of level. Sorry?
Up to 9.
9, thank you. John So, he died in 1824. So at a sort of really ripe old age. The famous Auguste A. Waite regarded the rectified rite as one he craved most. He said, come to see the regime écossais rectifié as maintaining more than any other rite the essential essence in ritual form of that secret tradition that tells us not alone that the soul cometh from afar, but the soul returns whence it came, but it delineates the path of ascent. Whatever that means. It was for him the secret tradition in practice. So, it was quite significant from that point of view. Now, we can see from this that while English Freemasonry was sort of simplifying, de-Christianizing to some extent, but certainly reducing any Catholic influence, and really becoming more generic, French Freemasonry went in almost the opposite direction. All right, becoming, adding complexity, additional Christian-based philosophy and theosophy to the structure and ritual, those practices continue through these French rites. The French rite itself, now back in action, and in fact growing in France, the rectified rite and the ancient accepted rite. So, the French influence is still there, one could say quite strongly. So, due to the time, I'm just about on time. Yes? The time constraints, this has been a very rapid gallop through some of the main players, just to give you a feeling for the subject. As I said, it is, to be honest, quite complicated, quite complex. Certainly the philosophy and theosophy is extremely complex, and I don't claim to really understand all of it. I can point you at people who do claim to understand more of it than I do, quite happily. It's interesting. It certainly shows a view on Masonry which is very different to the basic English emulation view, I think. And it opens up a different point of view. And, it's like everything else in this life, you can take it or leave it as you wish. So if any other questions, I'm quite happy to take them from there.